Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Pride at Work Canada's 2022 virtual ProPride, where we will be joined by an absolutely wonderful panel of community leaders to discuss some of the nuances of really supporting 2SLGBTQIA plus resurgence beyond performative allyship. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I hope that everyone has had a safe and happy and affirming start to both Pride season and to Indigenous History Month. This is a very exciting and busy time of the year, so we really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. My name is Connor Pio. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. I'm one of the senior programs coordinators here at Pride at Work Canada, and I will be your MC for the day. And before we get started, I'd like to let folks know that we have live closed captioning available today. So thanks to National Captioning Canada and 3Play Media. Shout out to the wonderful captioner who is joining us. And so to access, hide or modify the settings of the captioning, just go to your Zoom toolbar and find the icon with the letter CC, and it'll pop open a box for you and you can take it from there. Also, Zoom already let you know this event is being recorded, and so the recording of the event will be available for attendees following the event, and it'll likely also end up on our YouTube channel. And you will also get a copy of the slide deck, which will have lots of links and resources for you to check out afterwards. And as a note, my wonderful colleague has already let folks know we are in webinar mode, which means that participants' cameras and microphones are automatically switched off, so you don't need to worry about that. And then, so the best way to engage with us, as some folks are already doing, is through the chat. So that's on the Zoom control bar is the icon with the one text bubble. So feel free to connect with Pride at Work staff and your fellow participants there. When it comes time to the Q&A near the end of the event, we encourage folks to submit your questions through the Q&A function that's also in your Zoom control bar. So if you can find the little icon that has the two text bubbles, that's the Q&A function. That's a really great place to put in your questions, and that way they won't get lost in the chat. And then if you experience any kind of technical issues or have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to connect with us. So my colleagues, Luis and Celine, are both available to support. And so feel free to reach out to them directly if you need anything throughout the event. To start us off today, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement, related to where I'm calling in from today. So Pride at Work Canada's main office, as well as my home office, they are both located in Takarundo or Toronto. And these lands and waters are the traditional homes and territories and cared for by the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, Toronto is home to Indigenous people from all across Turtle Island and beyond. This, of course, includes many Afro-Indigenous and urban Indigenous people, as well as Two-Spirit, trans, and queer Indigenous people. And Toronto is situated within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, which is held specifically between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. However, I'm a big believer that all Torontonians are treaty people. We have roles and responsibilities that are tied to Treaty 13, to the Williams Treaties, as well as to the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. And last but certainly not least, I was recently reminded by a friend of mine not to forget to acknowledge the land itself. And so I just want to give my many thanks to the earth, the lands and waters that sustain us, the plant beings, the trees, medicines, foods, animal beings. So, all of those that crawl or walk, slither, swim, fly, to the seasons, so spring, summer, fall, winter, and everything in between, the weather, the winds, the clouds, the rain, snow, thunders, lightning, and the celestial beings, so sun, moon, stars, and neighboring planets. As humans, I think we're all very much dependent on all of these beings. They hold us and care for us, and so I offer them my thanks and gratitude. And I see folks are already doing this in the chat, but I welcome you to share a little bit about yourself, including where you're calling in from. And if you are based in Toronto, I highly recommend you check out this fantastic resource, Polishing the Chain: Treaty Relations in Toronto. It's a series of recorded conversations that are available on YouTube, and I highly, highly, highly recommend them. I'd also like to share a little bit about who we are. So through dialogue, education, and thought leadership, Pride at Work Canada empowers employees to build workplaces that celebrate all employees, regardless of gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We help create safer, more inclusive workspaces that realize the full potential of all employees and bring down barriers to employment. Our learning, networking, and community events, they happen all across the country, celebrating and connecting the most inclusive Canadian employers. And I would also like to acknowledge our partner for this event, which is the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, a nonprofit research organization. SRDC's two-part mission is to help policymakers and practitioners identify policies and programs that improve the well-being of all people in Canada, with special concern for the effects on equity-deserving groups, and to raise the standards of evidence that are used in assessing these policies. And the data that we will, be weaving into the conversation today actually comes from the research project led by SRDC, which was done in collaboration with Dr. Sean Waite at the University of Western Ontario, as well as Pride at Work Canada and the Labour Market Information Council. And this project is looking at the economic, employment, health, and social outcomes that are experienced by LGBTQ2S+ individuals in Canada, and really how those experiences, may be different from their cisgender heterosexual peers. And all three reports are now available to download. You can access them both through Pride at Work Canada's website as well as through the SRDC. And again, lots of links in the slide deck that you'll have access to following the event. We'd also like to acknowledge that the research project was funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada, also known as WAGE. So much gratitude to WAGE for funding this work. And onto today's agenda. So we will start with some more introductions, some opening remarks, and then we'll move towards the panel, followed by an audience Q&A, and then we'll briefly go through some of the exciting upcoming events and the resources that we've included as part of today's presentation, and some closing remarks. And just a few notes for audience engagement. So Pride at Work Canada's values include belonging, dignity, and justice. So please, please, please help us to cultivate an inclusive and accountable virtual space by asking questions and engaging in the chat with, with respect and care and compassion. A reminder to please use the Q&A function to ask questions that are related to the topic of discussion. And just to note that we will likely not be able to answer every question, but you're welcome to contact us following the event at info@prideatwork.ca if we didn't get to your question. And so to start us off in a good way, I have the absolute pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Saylesh Wesley, whose pronouns are she and her. Saylesh is an educator and a knowledge keeper, who will be both offering opening and closing remarks, as well as joining us for the panel discussion. Saylesh Wesley is a Stolo and a Tsimshian teacher who graduated from UBC's Native Indigenous Teacher Education Program and later completed her Master's of Education from UBC. Saylesh now works for the Chilliwack School District. Her passion as an educator lies within the fields of Indigenous and LGBTQ and Two-Spirit education. And honestly, I could gush about Saylesh for forever. I am so grateful that you were able to join us today, Saylesh. And so I will now turn off my microphone and stop sharing the slide deck and invite you to start us off with an opening.
Beautiful. Thank you, Connor. And thank you for your thoughtfulness with regards to the land acknowledgement. A swale telsiaya, palactanot telsqui, talitza scow kale, casta musquium, casta kitsum calum. A telsqualawel, quals quits lala. What I've just shared with you is that my name is Saylesh Wesley. My traditional name is palactanot. I have roots in the Stalo territory, which is where I reside right now. My mother is Stalo, and my father is Tsimshian from Kitsum-Kalem, BC. I also have ties in Musqueam all the way down the river to here. It's wonderful to be here today, and I am so grateful to be a part of such a special presentation event such as this, especially in the times that we're enduring. I think a lot of us have made very good friends with our ability to wield trauma. It's been a long couple of years through this pandemic, and I certainly am aware that my place as a marginalized person is certainly shaky. It seems as though the further in the margins that we are, the more susceptible we are to things like, dealing with our own mental health, dealing with our own physical health. It's been quite a time to navigate what it meant and what it felt like and what it looked like to get through the pandemic. There have been other issues, it seems like we've just been caved in upon. I have a reason to delve into the darkness here. We're reaching back, and the reason I'm doing this is, to lift us out, at least in a metaphorical way. So we have been visited by the pandemic. We have been visited by the announcement of the 215 back in last May, which changed the game of, the reason why we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have recently witnessed and experienced the atrocities of war and how frightening that is for all of us, especially those of us who are ones who like to hold space for the light. I hope you're able to follow me with how I speak. When I do present, I tend to turn inside out. In other words, my physical being becomes spiritual. And so it's my spirit that talks and channels. And sometimes the things that come through are, surprising to me as well. It's like I'm sitting with all of you listening to somebody else speak, but watching my mouth do it. So anyways, I just wanted to acknowledge these very difficult situations, these painful experiences that the world has gone through. The mass shootings, I don't know how or why someone would allow such evil to flow through them and commit such a deed, especially to the beautiful, innocent children that are our greatest resource. It's like I have been in this state of weeping now since the 215, since the pandemic. And I find myself sometimes feeling unable to pray. And so I don't know about all of you. I feel like it's time for blessings. And so we have events such as this, and we come together like this with one heart and one mind. And all we can do is imagine that, as hard as it's been in the last few years, that there must be some beautiful things, some wins, some blessings, some celebrations yet to be had. And imagine if we, those of us who live in the margins, pretended to have privilege. Imagine what that would be like for us to be able to wield privilege in ways that truly, truly demonstrate what it means to be an ally. That term is a very, very political hot potato. Allyship isn't something that's necessarily easily definable or contained. And as much as we'd like to think that we will have a hand in shaping what authentic allyship can be, ultimately it's in the hands of those who we need to give us that allyship. They're the ones that will determine how they carry it or not. They're the ones who will determine how they use it or not. They're the ones who will figure out what it means for them to be allies, because we can't force anybody to do what we think we need them to do. All we can do is continue waiting, praying, hoping, and believing that better days will come. We are all good people, and we need to remember that. I speak for the rest of the stewards of this good earth on this beautiful Turtle Island, and I plead with all of you to remember that our job on this earth is to be stewards of the land, whether you're Indigenous or you're not. Capitalism has certainly taken things to a whole new level. The surge of gas prices makes things very difficult. And so I ask all of you to stand with those of us in the Indigenous realm and position ourselves as allies, as stewards to the land. And perhaps that allyship, that stewardship, can share that magic with those who have the privilege to lift us up and to place us in situations and in environments where we will feel valued, respected, and loved. It's a miracle that we are here together like this in these times. I think about the other experience that shook me a little bit, and that's the freedom convoy. It's ironic how that freedom can be spun in such a different way to make it seem like it's they're riding for freedom, and yet the message that they're sending is actually very different. The way I received it was not exactly how it looked. I think all of you know where I'm going with that. So I will leave you with some teachings that I've received from some of my elders to set the tone for this beautiful conversation that we're about to have. I think about the 7 laws of life. One of my great uncles shared this with my family, and it helps us to remember why we're here and how we're going to leave the earth better than the way we found it. We must certainly, and in the spirit of the 94 calls to action, beautifully weave together what it means for us to keep our bodies healthy. A lot of us have endured a great deal of health situations and traumas through the last couple of years, I think because of stress, because of trauma, etc. So I encourage you all to eat more greens. I encourage you all to forest bathe, walk through the cedars, walk through the ferns, and allow those beautiful spirits to help you with the energies that you don't need and to give you the energy that you do need. The next law is happiness. That one speaks for itself. Sometimes when there is no reason to be happy, we have to create them. It isn't easy to do when we are going through times like this, but that's the only way that we're going to save ourselves and each other, is to try to find reasons to celebrate. Sometimes there need not be one at all. The next law is generations. We have conversations like this. It's recorded. Thank goodness for the technological era. I am not a technological savvy person, but I'm grateful that others around me are, so that our future generations have something to refer to when those of us come together like this with beautiful minds and beautiful hearts to create history and to support our humanity with our endeavor to create allyship and, to just be good people. The next one is generosity. I can't stress that one enough. We live in a very capitalistic world that is governed and ruled by the very dollar that we need to continue buttering our bread. I invite you to think of the generosity as an opportunity to share our wealth, whatever that may be. It doesn't have to be monetary wealth. Generosity of our spirit, generosity of our compassion, generosity of our sympathy and empathy. Our next one is humility, of course. Humility is certainly an attribute that is very much missing from our world. It is so beautiful when you're upon an elder and they make you feel like you're a shining star with just one look in their eyes. And the only feeling that you receive from them besides love is humility. Our teachers, our elders, and all of the people that are here, we have an opportunity to learn and to feel and to experience humility at a divine level. We must forgive. We must forgive ourselves and one another and everything else that's hurt us and hurt this world. We will not move forward. We will not heal until we certainly do and perform what it means to truly forgive. And the last law is understanding. Not all of us are on the same page. Not all of us are at the same level of growth when it comes to our own spiritual evolution. We must accept that about each other and accept each other for where we are and be kind to one another and be good to one another. So I hope that these opening comments help to set the tone for this beautiful conversation. I hope that all of us have a wonderful day. And my goodness, I ask that all of you have a beautiful sleep tonight and wake up feeling fresh and ready for a new miracle tomorrow. Lahai.
Lahai, Ginanaskawith, and many, many thanks to you, Saylesh, for those beautiful words. I appreciate so much those reflections and the offering of those laws as reminders, and also for your presence. I really do feel that sense of love and humility just by sharing this space with you. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's panel discussion, Colin Drewen, whose pronouns are he and him. Colin is the Executive Director at Pride at Work Canada, a role that he has had since 2014. And he is an absolutely brilliant business strategist with more than 15 years of experience working within 2SLGBTQIA+ communities. He's originally from Coal Harbour, Nova Scotia, and received a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Ascot University, and then went from that to completing executive education programs at both the Rotman School of Management and Harvard Business School. And so I have so much gratitude to you, Colin, for agreeing to moderate this discussion. And so I will pass the virtual microphone over to you.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you so much for all your thorough preparation for today's event. I can see that we've got over 500 participants today. So it's really a testament to your ability to build an event that really engages not only our proud partners, but the public in the conversation today. Connor mentioned that I started with Pride at Work Canada in 2014. And that was the same year that Saylesh's essay, Twin Spirited Woman, was published by the Duke University Press. And that essay was quite instructive for me. And it's one that I returned to again and again over the years because it brought such inspiration to me. So Saylesh, thank you very much for, as you said, delving into the darkness so that we can hold space for the light and start our conversation today in a good way. I really appreciate you being here, and I look forward to hearing your perspective on the panel as well. Saylesh mentioned that the term ally is a bit of a political hot potato, which I wrote down because I just thought it was so fabulous a term, because really what we're talking about today is, organizations' actions versus their rhetoric, right? So we look at companies like AT&T that sponsors a lot of Pride events across the United States, but also this year donated more than $500,000 to campaigns of legislators who are looking to legislate queer and trans people out of existence. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And Pride at Work Canada was so eager to participate in the research that we'll be referencing throughout our conversation today with SRDC, mostly because the team that was working on it was mostly people from queer and trans communities. At Pride at Work Canada, we work with a lot of employers, and some employers are hesitant to take information and data and research from community-led organizations. But in my experience, Two-Spirit queer and trans people are actually pretty smart cookies. Like, we actually kind of know what we're doing here. So I'm really excited to get started of our conversation today. And I really encourage you to go back and read not only the research that we'll be referencing today, but look up everything from Community-Based Research Center, TransPulse, some of these organizations that are led by Two-Spirit queer and trans people, because we are capable of telling our own stories. And I hope that is what is messaged through today's panel. So I'd love to introduce some of the folks we'll be talking to today. I believe that first, I'll be introducing Margaret Robinson, who has spoken with us before. Margaret is an associate professor at Dalhousie University, which is one of our proud partners at Pride at Work Canada. And we're very eager to hear what Margaret has to say about not only the research that we'll be referencing, but about her experience researching equity deserving groups. And we'll also be speaking with Karine Mirjani Jean-Francois, who is a gender-based analysis plus planning advisor with the City of Montreal, another proud partner of Pride at Work Canada. And of note is that Karine Mirjani is also the co-chair of the Conseil Québécois LGBT, which is Quebec's Federation for 2SLGBTQIA+ organizations. And last but not least, we'll be speaking with Chloe Halpenny, who is a research associate with the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, which I'll be referring to as SRDC throughout our conversation. Chloe brings a passion for justice-oriented research, and it was an absolute pleasure to work with Chloe and the team at SRDC on the research that we'll be talking about today, building the evidence base about economic, health, and social inequities faced by LGBTQ2S+ individuals in Canada. And of course, Saylesh will also be joining us on the panel to talk from her experience about our topic today. So I encourage all of our panelists to please turn their cameras on so we can see your beautiful smiling faces. And I can ask you some questions so that people can stop hearing me jammer on because you're the main event. This is who we want to speak to. And I'm really eager to hear from each of our panelists first, just to make sure everybody can kind of appropriately frame our conversation. So in the research that I referenced from SRDC that was supported by Pride at Work Canada and other partners, one of the things that was noted by some of the survey participants or the focus group participants was performative inclusion. And that's really, Connor drew from that for the title of today's event, where we talk about that performative inclusion. And it was identified by participants as widespread in their workplaces. So I'm wondering if, to frame our conversation today, and we'll start with Margaret, and then we'll talk to Karine Milchani, and then Chloe, and then Saylesh. If we could talk about, from your experience, what's an example of performative allyship in a workplace context? And what comes to mind as an impact, understanding that our audience today are a very savvy group of employees and job seekers who are looking to make a difference in their workplace. They're looking to go and make a difference. So starting with you, Margaret, can you please share with us an example?
Sure, Colin. The example that comes most immediately to mind is once when I was working at a hospital that shall remain nameless because it's kind of litigious. I was invited to give a talk for Pride Week, and at the same time that they were busy talking up their wonderful LGBTQ positive policies, they were also offering therapy for trans youth that was essentially a type of conversion therapy. And so that really made it difficult because some people in our community wanted to celebrate that this big employer has seen the light and is doing these wonderful policy changes. But other people were saying, well, this isn't applying to everybody. You can't start celebrating them when they're still actively oppressing members of our community. And so it was splitting the community in a lot of ways that were not really positive. And they didn't seem very open to seeing that critique sometimes. And so as a community-based researcher trying to do great work with queer communities, it was difficult because I remember one community member said, "You work for the evil empire. I would never participate in research you were running as long as it's happening there." And so it was difficult to do the work even sometimes. So yeah, those were that's what came to my mind when you talked about the performative inclusion. Thanks, Colin.
Well, thank you for that, Margaret. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing. And I really appreciate you bringing that idea of trust into the conversation, where when an organization engages in that kind of two-headed behavior, it becomes even harder to create relationships with two-spirit, queer, and trans communities. So thank you so much for that example. So Karine Milchani, can you please answer the question? So give us an example of performative allyship and perhaps touch on the impact that it could have.
Sure. So as someone who's both Black and queer, I felt like often like those employee groups like make me have to pick, right? It's always this idea that I have to be one or the other, and I rarely be both. In the past, I worked in a small organization and I did amazing work with Black youth and amazing work with trans and queer trans youth, more university age. And something that was always coming back was that the queer youth were not like the queer youth that were high school age, were not really well welcomed. The staff, the people that work with them were not super. But then for a lot of the trans youth and queer youth that, use the services, but were more university age, for those that were Black, Indigenous, or racialized, that was the opposite because it was not the same stuff. And something that would come up over and over, and it manifests a lot after I left, was this idea that, and it really was very clear, that some of us were queer, some of us were racialized, but very few of us were both. And what happened was that those of us who were actually got more of the youth coming to us because they were like, you'll understand. You won't just see me as X or this. You won't see me as the case or another case or as something that doesn't fit what you currently do. And that's always a problem as an impact because it means that the staff who do hold both identities and are out in both of those things, which is not that complicated when you're Black, anyway, for me, means that we have more work, but also we're the people that people come to us all the time to be like, hey, can you talk to your colleague about this? Can you talk to this other colleague about that? And we have to play this role of mediation between both of our communities because part of us, and for those youth, was not always seen.
Great, thank you for that so much. Yeah, we often hear at Pride at Work this idea of protective invisibility, where folks say, well, you can hide who you are at work, which is very illustrated by you right now. It's not the case for everyone, and when folks do that, it increases the burden on their colleagues as well. So thank you so much for bringing that in. Chloe, can you please share some examples of performative allyship and the potential impact for our audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start with a little bit of a preamble, which you probably didn't want, but you mentioned I'm one of the researchers who was working on this project, and I'll be drawing mainly sort of throughout this discussion from some of what we found when we spoke with folks in the most recent phase of research. But I'm going to try really hard to avoid sounding like a researcher and instead coming to the discussion as someone who has the privilege and the responsibility to share the experiences of folks we spoke with, of folks that are in my own community. So in terms of this performative allyship piece, a more general example, but this came up pretty frequently with folks in the context of like defensiveness. And this idea of people working in companies or for bosses who did say, I'm an ally to queer and trans folks, or maybe also racialized folks or disabled folks or women. We're against homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. And then when either the boss slipped up or the company slipped up or somebody else slipped up, which is inevitable because nobody's perfect, or somebody said something that was not great, people would think, okay, it's really nerve-wracking bringing this forward, but I can because I've been told that I can. I've been told that this person is an ally. And often it was the case where when things were brought forward, the supervisor, the boss, whoever would get really defensive and say things like, well, this is impossible. We work in the realm of social justice. We have this policy in place. I'm an ally. We had someone who brought up homophobia in their workplace and was told that she had crossed a line, that it was insulting to even say this. So I think it's a really natural response, but it's one where, often a really quick one, and people made the decision to come forward really carefully. It wasn't something that people took lightly. It often meant that they, had some degree of trust in their employer to be able to hold that feedback with care. And I think that idea of trust, Colin, that you brought up is really where the impact or implication comes in. Because when this happened, people thought, well, I won't be bringing forward any feedback again, either at this workplace or often in future workplaces as well, because it was like, you've been burned, not going to do it again. So that implication for the individual, but also for employers, because that feedback loop becomes closed and that opportunity for learning and improvement is lost moving forward.
Thank you, Chloe. It's really, you mentioned, it's a completely human reaction to become defensive, but you make a choice not to see that as, really truly compassionate feedback that folks are really trying to give to improve the environment for everyone. So I really appreciate that very much. And last but not least, Saylesh, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question about performative allyship and the potential impacts. Please let us know what you think.
It's kind of an open-ended question, right? Because performative allyship can be defined in any way that the individual can think of. I guess to me, I will look at the glass as half full and say that instead of calling performative allyship as something that is, it can be a checkbox thing, and therefore it gets people off the hook. And they feel like they've done their due diligence and that's all they care to do. So they're performing something that they really should be sincerely doing. And but I'll spin it in a positive direction with hopes that those who truly do have an authentic intention to include others and to be mindful of those who do dwell in the margins, that they are informed, that they are doing what they can to educate themselves and to inspire the rest of the team to do the same. It's certainly, you know, when you dwell in the margins like this, you become very, very keen, and it's like we have this heightened sixth sense to be able to determine what somebody brings to the space. You know, you can feel it from them. And so I think that it would be wonderful if we had supervisors who make it very clear, explicitly clear, that they would like their team to do the work that they need to do to basically just be good people, you know, and treat everybody well, and to, you know, sort of move their egos out of the way and allow space for real intimate and loving connections with one another. I think that, you know, it isn't rocket science to perform allyship. It is something that you either do or you don't. And if you're faking it, then don't do it. You know, if it's something that you are truly invested in, and even with mistakes and blunders, you know, that's amazing. And, you know, when you are truly showing an effort to be inclusive, to be an ally, and you are really doing what you can to not sweep things under the rug, but address them, you know, it's safer to be mute or to turn a blind eye, when in fact we really need to examine everything that happens and what those uncomfortable moments are, what's causing them, you know, and so that we're able to bring it to the table, address it, and, you know, thank it for the lessons that it's taught us. But ultimately, let's get it off the table, not sweep it under the rug, and truly throw it out into the trash, you know. And so it would be marvelous to sit and listen to those who really do have that intention, and you can feel it when they have that intention. And so it's you know, it isn't rocket science, it is common sense, but through everybody's trauma these days, common sense is becoming a superpower. So I hope that answers some of people's wonderings. Thank you.
Thank you, Saylesh, for that. I appreciate your ability to, as you said, you know, hold space for the light. Sometimes we get so caught up in the challenges. It can seem so dire, it can seem so difficult, but your ability to really help us see how our actions can make a brighter future is it's much appreciated. Thank you so much. Karine Mirjani, you know, it's been almost 30 years since Kimberly Crenshaw first started talking about intersectionality to kind of describe the way different forms of power collide to shape individual experiences of the world, most notably in the workplace. So maybe, are you able to talk about, from your experience, you know, thinking about some of the things we've been talking about, how that concept of intersectionality should be introduced into workplaces and conversations about queer and trans and two-spirit inclusion?
Sure. And maybe for me, intersectionality doesn't necessarily start with Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar. So we had the same kind of learning and thinking in a lot of ways. But I think about like the foremothers, and I say foremothers because a lot of them were Black women, often queer. I'm thinking about Sojourner Truth, I'm thinking about Audre Lorde, Patricia L. Collins, and it sounds like, oh, is it an American context concept? And for me, it's not. It is simply because those women were often marginalized in so many ways, in so many spaces, and we're able to find other people just like them that live the same thing to be able to think it through. which is not always the case when you're the only one and you only have 2 other friends. You know, when you can talk to 50, 100 people in the same city who live exactly the same thing in all those spaces, then it's easier to be like, oh, it's not just me. When I think about intersectionality, for me, it's super important because, as I mentioned, I'm someone who's a both Black, queer, and a woman. I'm also someone that doesn't quite fit in those cases, right? Often, and I think for some, maybe for some people who identify within those LGBTQIA plus communities, you fit into a little, like one of those letters and it's perfect and there's nothing else that identifies you from the norm. But for a lot of us, we're always others. And when we think about intersectionality, it's about recentering the margins. It's about understanding that we're not just a case, but we're more complex than that. And especially that this systemic discrimination is part of what we live in different ways. For me, Allyship, when we think about it, is about building together. It's about becoming co-conspirator. It's not about being an ally one time and getting a cookie. It's really about alleviating systemic barriers. And the thing that's really amazing within our communities, I think, is that we are multiple. Within our communities, some of us have trans history, trans experience, some of us have disabilities, some of us are Indigenous, some of us are immigrants, some of us don't have status. There's so many things that actually divide us, and yet we still try, not always successfully, but we still try to stand together, to roll together forward, to be together, to move those barriers. I think that the true thing that we can do, and I think something that intersectionally allows me and allows a lot of people around me to do, is to really be yourselves fully everywhere we go. We're not just in one case or another. We don't just have to flatten part of ourselves. And I would liken that to a lot of what my trans friends have told me, where you have to fit this narrow thing about like, this is how a man or a woman should look like, or a non-binary person should look like. And that means that there's work to do. If we want to be able to have everyone be who they are, yes, it's common sense, as said Saylesh, but it's, for me, it's more than that. It's also about doing the research, and research doesn't mean like reading like complicated like a doctoral thesis. It can be podcasts, it can be roundtables, it can be books. Obviously, I'm a big reader, but it's also about being open and humble. We're gonna mess it up. We're not gonna be perfect. Sometimes we'll try things and we are not doing it properly. Sometimes we've learned how to do things, and to be honest, it may not be the best way. We have to be ready to unlearn, to create this magic that actually brings us as a community together. It's also about changing how we do things, because sometimes you know, I always think about this way that I learned growing up as a Francophone to say, to gender people, right? And that was what was polite. You know, if you didn't call someone Mr. or Mrs. or Miss, I never quite get it in English, that wasn't polite. You know, you were being really rude, and, you know, you were raised better than that. But actually, is that politeness, or is just like old ways of gendering people just because it's easier to put people in a small case? It's also about truly including those of us who are at the margins of our groups, right? I might be Black and queer, but I'm also a cisgender woman. So, and I'm someone who's worked heavily with people, with the women with disabilities and deaf women. And that means sometimes learning different ways of communicating. I'm taking ESL. I'm not perfect. Do not quiz me. But, you know, those are the ways that we're truly building communities and truly being those co-conspirators of changing the world. It's also about seeing others as an individual, not as a case, especially when we do hiring. In the workplace, often we want a case, you know, we have our KPI and we're like, we need to hire X, Y, Z, and those are the people we want to hire. But the people we're hiring, how we're maintaining them in employment, how we're promoting them, are we like making sure that they're succeeding in what they're doing? And inclusion means being present. And for a lot of you, Pride Month is June. It's not quite the case where I'm calling from. I'm in Montreal, in Jojage, in Ganiganaha. Our Pride is in August, so are most of the Pride events here. But there are other days that are symbolic for a lot of us, right? And those days are not just the month of June. It's not just what happened in Stonewall. It's also about May 17th, you know? It's also about the invisibility, invisible like lesbophobia. It's also about realizing that there's a National Accessibility Week. It's also about remembering that June 21st is really important for people who are Indigenous, LGBTQIA, our true spirit, right? it's also about being every day. And I think it's especially more important. And recently it was I don't know if it's an anniversary, it's not quite how I want to remember it, but of the Pulse shooting that mostly affected Latinx and Black LGBTQ communities in Orlando. We had the Buffalo shooting that targeted Black people. But we also had the Islamophobic attacks and murders in London and in Quebec City. How we're talking about those on our workplaces? How are we seeing the people in our teams that are especially affected by those? But mostly, what are we doing to make sure those events don't happen? I think that as an employer and as a group and as human beings, mostly, we each have an individual and collective responsibility to make this world a better place for those who are less lucky, less privileged. And especially when we think about being co-conspirator, truly being allies in an intersectional ways, which means not just being like, I'll sign your petition once, but showing up every day and being ready to not getting it right, trying again and again and again, and being present in both ways that are super visible, like a flag and this and pronouns and our signature, but also in just like checking in with people, learning on our own, and just keeping on learning what we've learned and trying to infuse, our own little, I think that I like to say that we have our own little like a queer magic inside of us. Maybe it's a lesbian magic or two-spirit magic, intersex magic, whichever, but I call it queer because I'm queer. And it's also about how do we make this magic that we have that's amazing, shareable within our whole community, but also with people who may not be part of our communities as well, to make sure that they also have this magic within themselves, so the world is better for them too.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate you bringing up the tragic events of the Pulse shooting. I remember when that took place, and a lot of employers were asking about their public messaging and, how are they supposed to respond to such an event? And really what I thought was equally important at that time was, how are your queer and trans staff doing? How are your racialized staff doing? Because those are the folks who are walking around every day really feeling, the impacts of that event and carrying that trauma with them and not being addressed. So it's not just about your customers and how the people on Facebook are going to respond to something like that, but what are you doing to support mental health within your own organization? So very much appreciate you bringing up events like that and the tragic events in Buffalo as well. So thank you very much. Saylesh, I'd love to ask you a specific question related to the research that we keep referencing, because respect for gender diversity came up again and again, the need for it in workplaces. And we know that the outcomes that we see, the economic outcomes are, significantly worse for folks who are trans or gender diverse. I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to how employers, colleagues, coworkers can act in allyship with two-spirit, trans, agender, non-binary communities.
Thoughtfully processing. It's uncanny how I have all of the answers to how are they keeping us oppressed and marginalized, and how are they, continuing to silence us. I think that, and I'm not saying that that's directly happening to me, but it's still this program that I believe, subconsciously, I still believe that, my place is in the margin, in the intersection of trans and indigeneity, and that I'm to be, basically seen and not heard unless I'm asked to speak. I still have this voice telling me to behave like that. And I'm not certain, I guess that's my trauma or the history of what I've been through, and generations of what my people have been through that pass on through our DNA. My goodness. I don't even know how to center the whole gender variance issue yet. I'm still working through the Indigenous component of my identity as it relates to being in the workplace. And so all I can say is that employers, colleagues, can demonstrate what it looks like to truly engage in conversations and for them to educate themselves formally as it relates to trans history, to spirit theory, to anything to do with anything that is on the gender variant scale, and to show that they are willing to work through their discomfort in doing so. They're willing and brave enough to be able to say how they're feeling, even if they are, concerned with sounding offensive or insulting. It's part of the process. They have to go through the gamut of facing themselves and what they've been programmed to do, just as we have to face ourselves and what we've been programmed to do. I wish that there was a magic wand that I could wave or just give them the ingredients to show what they look like when they are inclusive of anybody that's on the gender spectrum, and for that, not only for them to be aware of those on the gender spectrum, but to truly, meaningfully, and sincerely extend themselves with their learning and with how they conduct themselves with and for those of us on the spectrum of gender diversity. It's wonderful when I feel safe in a group of people and I can disclose who I am, not in a way that makes me feel like I'm coming out, but in a way that makes me feel like I just get to say what's going on in my head the way they do. Like they take their identities for granted. They take their cis heteronormativity for granted. They don't know their privilege. They really don't. People do not know their privilege until you point it out to them, and most often you're just met with a defensiveness. And it's not about, that's not my intention of pointing it out if I'm ever in the situation to do that. I want to get beyond the defensiveness and help them to see that, we have a beautiful destination ahead of us if you accept to come along with me. Everybody has free will and they have the right to determine what it means for them to be inclusive or not. And so I guess at the end of the day, it's I don't know. For me, I'm very spiritual, so I believe in fate. I believe in the magic of our Creator, and I believe in my own two-spirit power to be able to touch people and to be able to move people in ways that help them to be better, love better, to heal in them what has helped keep them in the darkness. And so it's not necessarily about an action that they can do. I guess it's a whole connection that has to happen between everyone. And if people are not willing or able, at least I appreciate their honesty. I appreciate when I know I'm in the presence of somebody who is very much centered in their ego and in their programmed thinking, wonderful. I know who you're not. So it helps me to just feel, I'm able to choose where I want to sit and who I want to be with. So it's wonderful to be able to ask these questions and have these conversations, but it's even more amazing when I get to see it in action.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate what you are saying about people being in darkness when they don't have the background or they don't take the opportunity to learn. We talk at Pride at Work Canada with a lot of employers who tell us, well, we don't have any trans employees. We simply don't. And we very politely remind them that trans people are everywhere. And just because you don't necessarily know that you have folks who are trans or non-binary in your employment environment does not mean that they're not there. They live in that darkness. So I thank you so much for your perspective. Margaret, one of the things that we've learned and was highlighted in the research that we're referencing today is that the challenges and the impacts of homophobia and biphobia and transphobia and other forms of discrimination, they're not felt evenly across queer and trans communities. As we talked about when we looked at the question about intersectionality and how other parts of one's identity influence, but even when we're taking a look at within the realm of sexual orientation, we saw an earnings hierarchy, and we actually saw folks who were bisexual or similar identities at the bottom of that hierarchy. And then when we look at like even just the example of straight men in Canada on average make about $56,000 a year, but bisexual women on average make about $26,000 a year. So as somebody who's done a lot of research around gender and done research specifically looking at the experience and the impacts of biphobia, what do you think about that? And what are some remedies that our audience can take from your experience?
I'll start by saying it sounds like your research is spot on, because that's what I've seen too in different studies. Bisexuals generally earn less than gay and lesbian people, certainly less than straight people. And even if they're more likely to have a degree, they're less likely to have a supervisory role. So they have the lowest job satisfaction. And we see this pattern start really early, around junior high sometimes, where bisexual people are being discouraged from pursuing their education. So sometimes they exit high school with lower marks, or sometimes don't complete a degree program at all. And so those cumulative impacts, biphobia impacts a bunch of things that then impact people's employment experiences. So that's one way that biphobia affects by employees, by reducing their perceived value to employers. And that just continues when people are in the workplace. So if you're looking to do something specific to help bisexuals in your workspace, look at starting salaries and look at promotion opportunities. Bisexual people often find that they are given a lower starting salary than other people. And we're not always sure why. We're not always sure what led to that. I do know sometimes we don't ask for more. And part of that is that we've been trained by that point to not see ourselves as very valuable. And so look at your workplace culture to see if you've got a unspoken rules that privilege some employees as more valuable than others. I did a study with a St. Mary's professor, Dr. Mariam Dilmalkani, and we found a strong preference in Canada's blue collar industry for straight male employees, that they got twice as many interview requests as our queer male candidates. And so that wasn't surprising. What we did find surprising was that in the blue collar industry, at least, queer women and straight women were valued almost equally, that they kind of fell between the straight man and the gay man, or the queer man. So there wasn't really a difference that way. There was more of a gendered preference. And so looking at how can you make workplace culture not about everybody having to have the same kind of experiences or belong to the same groups, but to have a workplace culture that respects difference. We often talk about supporting people to be out in the workplace, but you have to acknowledge that coming out is not always positive. For bisexual people, our physical and mental health gets worse when we come out. And part of that is because we're then targeted for particular types of harassment. So bisexual people who come out at work are often asked to justify or explain our identities. We're sometimes targeted for sexual harassment. And our coworkers generally report that they feel entitled to ask bisexual people questions about our identity, and they feel entitled to that information. And so they may perceive us as antisocial or as secretive or rude or just not a team player if we're not open to being interrogated that way. In terms of looking at workplace policy, check the wording of the policy. Sometimes if the policy focuses on people having same-sex partners, it can let a lot of oppressions slip through, that having a same-sex partner is not always the primary way that queer people are oppressed, that there are lots of types of harassment that don't focus on who your partner is. So take a look at that, see if there are policies that could be refocused for working for people no matter what kind of relationship structure they're in. Bi people often also have worse physical and mental health. So having health policies in your workplace that let people take flex time if they're having a rough day, or that offer benefits for mental health support can be really helpful for bi employees. And remember that bi and pan people at work might be targeted for other types of aggression other than biphobia and bi erasure. So workplace harassment is highly gendered, for instance. Bi women report more verbal harassment. And so part of that is the fact that they're being targeted as women, that they're being targeted as hypersexualized because of their bisexuality, but also because of their perceived femininity. Bi people in less powerful positions at work also report more aggressions. So all of these pieces come together to say, this person is perceived as someone it's safe to be mean to. Older workers often find that they face more verbal discrimination than younger workers in some studies. And then finally, I would say the classic is, don't assume that it is the job of bisexual people in your workplace to fight biphobia, that this is the job of the employer, that sometimes leaving it to the oppressed individual to let you know when it's happening, to tell you how to fix it. This is all work that you can Google. So taking that responsibility on as an employer to create a positive work culture, that's one of the biggest things that you can do. Certainly ask your employees and take their advice, but don't see it as their job to fix. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, I that last point resonates a lot with me. It's always struck me as a bit odd. It's like insult to injury when you you bring forward an issue and say, this is what I'm experiencing. And they say, well, what do you want us to do about it? And it's kind of like, well, it's not really my job. I'm the building inspector. Like, I'm telling you what's wrong with what's going on here. And you have to hire a contractor to come and fix it. Because like, I didn't bring my tools today and I have another job to do. So I really, really, really appreciate that. We hear that a lot from employees. Thank you so much. Chloe, we've been talking a lot about some of the things that were brought up in the research, in the focus groups and interviews that were maybe negative experiences, and really talking about what are some of the remedies that we have. But I know that when you were working on the research, there was also some really positive examples that came up where people were sharing some things that contributed to their full and equal participation in the workplace. Can you speak to what some of those examples were?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I love this question, and our team thought that it was really important and powerful to share examples of things that weren't exclusively awful. And people had, thinking specifically about allyship, people had a lot of examples of instances where that had been really meaningful and powerful for them in the workplace. So, one person who was a queer non-binary person who learned from speaking with colleagues that they were earning about $10,000 less than other people in the same position, and went to their manager and was like, this is kind of weird, isn't it? And their manager was like, yeah, that is kind of weird. And wrote an email to upper management, said, this person is really good at their job. They're earning less. Why? And they got a $10,000 pay raise, which, is important because we know from our research and others like TransPulse that LGBTQ2S+ people earn less money, especially bi folks and trans folks. But this person, like a kind of a combination of lots of cumulative good experiences, they felt like they were able to be a role model at work, and they were able to be like out and proud. And they had other queer people coming to them and asking for their advice on things. We had another example of somebody who was on an employee resource group and was doing a lot of work around like training and presentations and things like that, that were not being well attended, it was the same people who were coming to them, and it was people who kind of knew what was going on already. And there was a cis het white man in leadership who took it upon himself to put it in everyone's calendars and said, this is mandatory. Everybody's going to go to this. I think it's really important. And, you know, this person thought that this was a really important thing. Both they felt like their work was being valued and encouraged. More people were attending these sessions and people were seeing buy-in from leadership. And lots of, you know, these are examples of sort of allyship at more of a leadership level, but, you know, you don't need to be a boss, I think, to practice allyship either. So, you know, we heard about, you know, if your coworker misgenders someone in their absence, correct them. If you hear someone assume the gender of a coworker's partner or their sexuality, challenge that, you know, ask questions about people's family, like not invasive questions, but just like, how is your partner doing? Like normal questions that you would ask other colleagues as well. If you're cis, put your pronouns in your bio and your signature and your Zoom name. Join the employee resource group, not to lead it, but to help. There was somebody who was just beginning to socially transition at work and starting to present more femininely. She had a gym at her work, went to the gym one day, and the person at the front desk said, "Oh, I'll get someone to take you to the men's locker room." And she went back to her office and came back with someone who she knew was supportive. And her colleague said, "Oh, I've just brought my coworker in, and I'm going to take her to see the women's locker room. She's going to use the gym today." And that was that. And she got taken into the gym. You know, one last piece, this is more of my own experience, but still related to the project. I love what Karine Mirchani said about co-conspirators. And, you know, we often think of allyship as cishet people serving or otherwise privileged people serving as allies for relatively less privileged people, which I think is super important. But, you know, this research project kicked off shortly after I had started at my job, and I hadn't had many conversations with colleagues, was kind of just in my own little bubble, hadn't shared personal experiences or anything about my identity with others. And the lead of the project called me out of the blue one day and said, "You know, we have this project on queer and trans experiences in employment, and I think you might be a good fit. Like, maybe you'd like to be on this project." And I remember thinking, like, how did she know? But like very seriously, I remember feeling like I felt seen at work. I felt valued. I felt like I had somebody who I could go to. It was like a really big moment. So, you know, there were lots of examples of really, in many cases, small things, in many cases, bigger things, but these actions of people kind of just going out of their way to make sure that their coworkers felt safe, felt valued, felt comfortable. Often these were sort of things that happened in the absence of like bigger structural or systemic things. So, you know, in the instance of the change room, you know, had that person working at the gym front desk known that they shouldn't assume someone's gender when they walk into a gym, like that probably wouldn't have needed to happen. So not to undermine like the power of individual actions, because we heard again and again that those are really important. But I think just to underscore that, you know, these individual acts of allyship, while incredibly important, absolutely need to be complemented by policy changes, shifts in workplace culture, the changes in attitudes, all of the things that everybody here also knows. But yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you, Chloe. We're running short on time, and I want to, you know, there's a couple of questions that came up through the Q&A function, and one of them really dovetails nicely to your last point, Chloe. So I'm wondering if we can finish off with this question for everybody, that everybody can chime in on this question about, you know, what Chloe just said is very powerful, where, you know, we can take individual steps, but, you know, the steps that need to be taken are often systemic or organization-wide. So, you know, I'm going to try and kind of touch on the question that we got about how can our audience today as individuals, what's like one tip that everybody has for them about moving from that individualized action to trying to make broader change within their employment environment. So maybe Saylesh, could we maybe ask you first to chime in on that? What are your thoughts on going from the individual to that kind of the group change?
I'll keep it short and sweet because it occurred to me just as you were asking how I would respond. Thank you, Chloe and Margaret. Thank you, Karine, for everything that you have shared. It's unreal, the data that you're able to gather and how specific it is. But I think that it would be a really sound action of the employer to include this training, these conversations, this sort of work and endeavor in the job posting. Like if they have a job posting and they're trying to staff a position, and make sure that they start covering all of their tracks as they proceed in their hiring, that people are well-rounded, perhaps even well-versed, and perhaps someone who is able to speak to their own journey towards inclusion, and perhaps they have come from a place of phobia, or power and privilege that allows them to behave badly. And they're on a path to reconcile and to move towards a better way of thinking that is more inclusive, and then have their interview actually, a part of their interview, make it very clear that they have to speak to these issues, these social issues, because they're going to be working with colleagues who fall into these margins. And how are they going to proceed when they have to work with and for them? And just sort of make it a norm to include these conversations in such instances like this, because otherwise we continue with just putting the stickers on the door saying everybody's welcome here, but to truly take a bite out of what it means to be inclusive and supportive by such a broad and powerful action as the postings and the job interview as a starting place. So imagine where you could go from there.
Great, thank you. Chloe, any thoughts on that movement from the individual to the systemic?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple in my previous answer, but I'll say one more quickly. I think, in general, if you can, if it's safe for you to do so, start speaking up. And, I think especially in the context of performative allyship, there are ways to do this that maybe feel a little bit less terrifying because it can be scary. So just saying, I noticed that we had a post about Pride Month on our Twitter feed. So great to see our company advocate for queer and trans rights. Wondering if there are other actions planned to help support, our queer colleagues and communities, because I'd love to lend a hand. And that's a great place to start a conversation, I think, from a place of where can we move from here and how can I help? So that would be one tip.
Great, thank you. Karine Mirjani, what are your thoughts? You've already mentioned that, of course, you're in Montreal where Pride is in August. So, no truer words have been spoken. It doesn't end in June. What else do you think about that movement from the individual to organization-wide change?
I think training definitely is something that I recommend, and also giving the support to the employee resource groups as well as to train on topics that they don't necessarily master or that are further from their realities is one thing, something that I've done. So that's for bigger companies, obviously. But I think that also just taking the time to have a chat, at our staff meetings about different things. So in the past, when I've hired at a woman-specific organization, and I hired a non-binary employee who used the and them pronouns. What I did was I made everyone practice for about 2 weeks before they started. And I was like, okay, so how do we do? And then we would practice. I'd be like, okay, today you have to use the and them for me all day. And then I was like, it's okay, you'll get there. And it's, I'm not saying that this employee's experience at that workplace was amazing because I'm not in their shoes, but it was when you're hiring the first person of XYZ identities, especially in that case, someone who's trans or non-binary, is also to just be how would we behave, right? This whole like thing about common sense, and sometimes practice makes us perfect. And so that's a little trick that we can do. And obviously like putting signatures and like our pronouns in our signature and mentioning them is also something that I think makes it maybe easier for people who, you know, their pronouns are not so obvious. I'm super femme, so people always assume that I use she and her, which is true, but might make it easier for people whose gender is less obvious for others.
Thank you for introducing that intervention around practicing, because that's what we hear a lot from folks, is that it's too hard, I'm not going to remember it. I mean, it's not that hard, and you're not letting them off the hook that easy. So introducing that, it's genius. Thank you so much. Margaret, just some final words from you. Do you have any thoughts on that movement from the individual to the organization-wide change?
Yeah, that's something I've had to think about as a new person coming into a new workplace, is how do I move from being a person who's doing some interesting, helpful stuff maybe, to really seeing some sort of systemic change, so that when I'm gone, that change stays. So sort of future-proofing the organization. One of the things I've found useful is forming solidarity with other employees, not just other queer employees, but people who are in other marginalized positions. And so through that, you learn a lot of the things that are done to oppress LGBTQ people are also oppressing other people as well. And so, for instance, the additional work burdens that Corinne Marie-Jeannie mentioned, that I see right across the board. Racialized colleagues report the same kind of thing as Indigenous people and queer people are experiencing. So that's sort of especially downloading in a university of equity, diversity work, or of support for colleagues and students onto people who are already carrying a disproportionate burden. Another thing you can look at is targeted institutional giving. So studies that look at where does money for LGBTQ sort of work in the community go, it often doesn't go to bisexual organizations. In fact, when they did a national study looking at what kind of numbers are people donating and where is that money going, for 2 years, no money went to bisexual causes at all, $0, 2 years in a row. And they're still getting the least amount of money, even though bisexuals make up the majority of LGBTQ populations. So you can think about having your workplace direct some of their giving to groups that are disproportionately affected by that impact. And then in terms of hiring, look at shifting your hiring away from rewarding people for experience and shift it more toward rewarding people for skills. So if we've just focused on who's done the job before, then we're privileging people who've already benefited from from a whole system of unfair opportunities that privilege whiteness, that privilege maleness. And so looking at ways to break that cycle are really important. And yeah, if we don't do those things in a systemic way, if we don't get it into the policy, then as soon as all the friendly people leave, you're back at square one again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you, everybody, for all of your just incredible insight. I really appreciate it. In closing, I just want to thank Connor so much for organizing today, Saylesh for getting us started with the beautiful remarks at the beginning, and to the 3 other panelists, thank you so much. The only thing I would like to add, just from my experience with Pride at Work Canada as we close for our audience, is that, you know, when you're looking at your strategy, I really encourage you to think about balance, where I find that a lot of the organizations we work with, they tend to focus their strategy on the worst actors or the least learned in the organization. And how are we going to fix all these cishet people? And how are we going to teach them about 2SLGBTQIA plus communities? You know, where are we in that equation? Where are Two-Spirit, queer, and trans people in that equation? Our empowerment is really what is going to get movement on your strategy. We can be trusted to lead things, to really bring in good ideas, as is evidenced today by our wonderful panel. And I would just really encourage you to really consider, if your queer and trans inclusion strategy focuses on cisgender, heterosexual people, I think that you are missing a big part of the equation. So thank you very much, everybody. And Connor, thank you very much for getting us all closed out today. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Colin. And yeah, I'm just like echoing all of the gratitude and appreciation for you, Colin, as well as for all of our panelists, Chloe, Saylesh, Karin, Virginie, and Margaret. Thank you all so much for everything that you shared and offered. I know folks in the chat have been engaged throughout and just like sending all of their appreciation and gratitude for the things that folks have shared. I also want to take a really brief moment to thank the rest of the Pride at Work Canada team. Specific shout out to Luis and to Celine, as well as Jade, for all of their support in organizing and facilitating today's event. Also to our captioner, who has done a fantastic job captioning our event. And then, of course, to everyone who has joined us for today's conversation. I really appreciate all of our attendees, SRDC, our partners, and Wage, of course, for their support as well. And really quickly, I will just flag that you'll get a copy of the slide deck. There's a bunch of resources in here. I will also go through meticulously our chat and pull out all of the links that were shared in the chat and add them to this resource list for folks to reference after the event. And then I know my colleague Luis has done a great job of also encouraging folks to check out our upcoming events. So we have lots going on for ProPride, both hybrid events, so in-person and online events that are coming up. So I really encourage folks to check those out, go to our website and RSVP. And so with that, I'm speaking very quickly because I want to make enough time to hand it over back over to Saylesh to offer us some closing remarks and to end this conversation in a good way. So again, my sincere gratitude to you, Saylesh, for joining us and for helping us to end this conversation in a good way. Miigwech.
My goodness, my cup is full. I look forward to our June 21st National Peoples Indigenous Day celebration to help us launch back into the work that we need to do starting September 30th. I'm picking these days strategically as a way of helping us all to reconcile what it means for us to be hurt people or not. I think a lot of the responsibility, my dear people, falls in our laps, even though a lot of the harms are not caused by us. We still have to work super hard, and we have to do double, triple the work that everybody else has to do when you are in the margins. We have a lot to prove. And sometimes we don't realize that we are the ones perpetuating the harm because we're believing it. We believe what we're told. We believe our positions that we're given instead of creating the positions for ourselves. So I hope that we are all able to remember that we are allowed to have some privilege as well. I don't know what that looks like or how that will feel, but it's certainly something on the horizon that I will continue endeavoring towards. I look forward to the day that many of us are able to take ourselves for granted, the way cis white folk get to do, especially if they're heterosexual. Maybe that's the dream that's too big. Maybe we're not there yet in this century, but I won't stop dreaming and I won't stop imagining. And I hope that I get to have conversations within myself that undo the systems of harm that have shaped me to be who I am with trauma, hundreds of years of trauma, and to take that, thank it, let it run down the river and let go of it and see what else is there. You know, I can't be all trauma. None of us can be all trauma. We must have something in us that continues to make us resilient and magical. So with that, dear Canada. Thank you for this day. Thank you to Pride Canada. Thank you to the fellow panelists. I thank you for your good minds and your good hearts. May we all rest well. May we all sleep well. And may our health be blessed today so that we wake up tomorrow feeling ready to continue this good work. With that, I say, all my relations,